Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the BMAC family in memory of all Jews who have been lost to forced conversions over the course of our history. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please see the links and information in the show's notes below or email me svarimchatter@gmail.com. As alluded to there by the sponsor note, this podcast episode is about the riveting and unfortunately very sad story of Edgardo Mortara and the forced conversion of this child in the 19th century in the Papal States in Italy, but before it was the country of Italy. And as you'll hear more on the podcast, and I'll link to the excellent book in the show's notes below as well. Please subscribe and to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, the Svarim Chatter Substack, and Svarim Chatter YouTube. They're linked in the show's notes below. And also, please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it wherever it is that you listen to the podcast, whether on 24/6, Apple, and Spotify. And so while this episode isn't specifically 3 weeks themed, but it is a tragedy. So in that regard, I thought that it made sense to release the episode now. So I hope the listeners find the episode enlightening as much as it's very sad and infuriating in some sense if you read the book and you listen here to the episode. So with that, turn to the podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor David Kertzer, who is a research professor at Brown University. And for this episode, we'll be discussing his book titled The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been published in 18 languages. And we'll talk about the motion picture, perhaps at the end, soon to be major motion picture. So, and we'll be discussing Edgardo Mortara and this saga in 19th century Italy. So, thank you, Professor Kertzer, for joining me once again.
Thank you.
So, we'll start off. We'll give the basic structure of the story in a minute, but just even before that, how did you become interested in this story of Mortara, and then that you wrote an entire book on the story?
Well, years ago, I'd been working in Bologna on, among other things, in 19th century Italian history, and had been spent years really working in Bologna. And when a colleague, actually an American colleague who studied in Italy, mentioned whether I knew anything about the Mortara case, which I didn't. And I began to look into it, and I was kind of flabbergasted that this incredibly important case from the 19th century had been so entirely forgotten. And at the same time, I was kind of making you might say, a career transition. As an academic, I was eager to interest a broader public outside the academy in Italian history. And this just struck me as such a dramatic, important tale that had never been told. I decided both to do the original archival work to bring it to light, but also to write it in a way that would attract a broad public audience.
Okay, so let's talk about, I guess we should briefly discuss the story. Then we'll talk about Bologna or whatever. What's the basic overview, just so listeners can understand what we're going to be discussing here?
Well, the story begins in 1858. In June 1858, a Jewish family in Bologna, and it's important to note Bologna was in the Papal States at the time. Bologna was the second largest city after Rome itself. That was under the rule of the so-called Pope King, the Pope in his role as power over the state. And one day, there's a knock on the door at the home of the Mortaras, this Jewish family. And the police are there, much to their shock and dismay, and ask whether they are the parents of the 6-year-old child, Edgardo. And of course, this terrified them for good reason, given Jews had reason to be worried about their children being plucked off by the Inquisition. And in fact, this is what had happened. The Inquisitor of Bologna, many people seem to think the Inquisition was something from the 1500s, 1600s only, but there's still an Inquisition under the Papal States in mid-19th century Italy. And the Inquisitor heard a rumor that a Christian teenage illiterate servant girl in a Jewish family had secretly baptized a child. And the church had the position that a child who'd been baptized was Catholic and should not be raised by Jewish parents, and therefore the inquisitor, in fact, ordered the police, who were under papal control, to go to the home of this Jewish family and take their child away, send the child to a church institution to be raised. Of course, the family was horrified when the child was taken away after. So that's seen the last 2 days. They do everything in their power to try to get the child back, and this is a moment of transition for the Jews in Europe as they're increasingly getting equal rights to their Christian neighbors. And so something happens with the Mortara case that hadn't happened in many other such cases of Jewish children being plucked from their family in this way by the church. Namely, great pressure was brought to bear, international pressure is brought to bear on the Pope. So this becomes not only a family saga and a kind of Jewish saga, but also an important political saga that plays a significant role in the transformation of Italy.
Yeah, and that's something I want to, get to. The book really does discuss, and we'll get to that shortly. But really, just to mention a couple things, as you mentioned, Bologna really at that time in the 19th century is, as you say, the second largest city in the Papal States. And just to clarify a little further for the listeners, so the Papal States was something until the unification of Italy in the late 19th century was a reality. The Pope was a king, as you said, the Pope King. It was not, the Pope wasn't merely a spiritual leader. He also was he had a country. So what was Bologna like? What was it like? And what was it like? Also, a key point here to discuss on that as well is, what was it like for the Jews in the Papal States and in Bologna, where they had just recently been readmitted?
Well, in the 16th century, the popes issued a series of orders having to regulate the Jews under their domain, and the popes had ruled over the Papal States for 1,000 years by the time of the Mortara story in the 19th century. But the Pope at the time ordered the Jews to be limited to a limited number of ghettos that would be established in 16th century Papal States. And in fact, the flourishing Jewish community in Bologna was disbanded. The Pope did not authorize any Jews to be living in Bologna. Rome had the largest ghetto, but there were a number of others like Ferrara in the Papal States. So for some centuries, beginning in the 16th century and until Napoleon changes things when he occupies Italy at the turn of the 19th century, there are no Jews allowed to live in Bologna. But following Napoleon, who briefly takes over Italy and liberates the Jews from the ghettos, even with the reinstitution of ghettos in the Papal States, the Pope kind of turns something of a blind eye to a limited number of Jews living kind of semi-illegally in that sense in Bologna, perhaps a couple hundred. So that is the situation of the Jews in Bologna at the time. They weren't able to have their own official synagogue, for example, or their own rabbi. They had to kind of meet informally to hold the services and conduct various ritual functions.
Right, so the Mortara family wasn't from Bologna. I believe they're from Modena. How did they end up in Bologna, Edgardo's parents?
Well, in nearby Duchy of Modena, which came under an Este rulers, and the Duchy of Modena included the two main cities, Modena and Reggio Emilia. The father of Edgardo, this child is taken, came from the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Reggio, and the mother, Mariana, came from the Jewish ghetto in Modena. So each one had a ghetto. The Jews were limited, not quite as limited as they were in the Papal States, but they too had been confined to ghettos and were limited in where they could establish their businesses and so forth. But they were smaller cities. Bologna offered more economic opportunity as a more major city. So at a certain point, the Mortaras, who already had some of their small children, decided to move for presumably greater economic opportunity to Bologna, where Edgardo's father would establish a shop for selling drapery, kind of typical Jewish merchant business of the time.
Yeah, until really this unfortunate story occurs. So you already, you said how the police show up there and it's told over in the book. And first of all, I mentioned the book. Was a finalist for the National Book Award. Really a fantastic book. I enjoyed reading the book. It's quite gripping, sad, but it's a gripping read. It's
I'll say this, some academic books can be dry. It's not a dry book. It's a quick read. It's it grips you, when you read the book. And there'll be a link in the show's notes where you can purchase the book. But you kind of really relay in riveting fashion this incident that happens that night as they pull Edgardo away. And I don't know how much you want to mention here. We kind of mentioned it, but just if you want to just talk a little bit more about that and just explain also a little more to listeners, like how does this happen that they decide that the child someone claimed it was baptized, the Inquisitor it sends the police to go take the child. Like what exactly happened here?
Well, there is some mystery here. I've actually, I've worked in various archives for this book. And even after I wrote the book, I found more archival material. I've continued research, for example, in the Inquisition archives at the Vatican, and in the Jewish archives in the Rome, in the synagogue, and so forth. So there's still a bit of a mystery about, first of all, did the child ever get baptized? It's not entirely clear because this young woman who is it who would be a servant in a Jewish household? Well, it's a girl from the hill town, from an impoverished rural family who's working in Bologna in order to earn her dowry. And this woman in question has various difficulties, including getting pregnant a couple of times by Austrian soldiers who were protecting the papal power in Bologna. And she's accused of theft and so forth. So she is either overheard telling someone about that she says she baptized this child. By the way, she said she baptized him when he was 12 months old, so several years earlier than 1858. He's 6 years old at that time. And this is brought to the attention of the Inquisitor, or she may have gone directly to the Inquisitor, because it turns out the man who's the Inquisitor, who's a Dominican monk, is also the man in charge of giving dowries to deserving girls in Bologna at the time. And if she was desperate for a dowry and knew that, as she might have known, that he was the man who was in charge of giving out dowries to deserving young Christian girls, this could be a way for her to try to show that she was deserving, that she would stand out, namely that she'd baptized a Jewish child. But in any case, the Inquisitor hears this. He brings her in. He interrogates her. He sends his report to the central office of the Inquisition in the Vatican, in Rome. And by the way, the Inquisition, the Congregation of the Inquisition of the Holy Office, is headed by the Pope himself at the time, Pius IX. And they meet, decide what to do, and they basically send orders to the Inquisitor that the child cannot be allowed to remain, now that he's Catholic, having been baptized, to remain with the Jewish family. It has to be taken away and should be sent to Rome. And in Rome, there is what's called the House of the Catechumens, which had been set up in the 16th century, in good part for the conversion of Jews. And so the Inquisitor orders the papal police to go to the house and seize the child. Papal police, we know from their testimony subsequently, are in fact embarrassed by this. They don't like to have to take this child who's grabbing onto his mother's arms from her, but they feel it's their duty. And so the child is taken away. So there is this dramatic scene. In fact, the police are convinced to wait, not to take the child immediately, but the family pleads to be able to talk with the Inquisitor to convince him that their child has never been baptized. So it's only the following day that the child is actually taken.
Yeah, and as you say, you in the book really discuss the dramatic scene, and you have the police records for this. Just one more question on the alleged baptism, whether it occurred or not. So it wasn't an elaborate ceremony. She just claims she just sprinkled some water, whether she said something or not, and that's it. He was baptized. He's a Christian now at the time, in the eyes of the church.
Yes, basically. I mean, the amazing thing is you or I could baptize the child. I mean, you didn't even need to be Christian, let alone, be a priest. All you needed, according to the canonical law, was to have the serious intention that is, you couldn't do as a joke, and to sprinkle some water. She took it out of the kitchen, and sprinkle it on the child's forehead while pronouncing the very simple formula, which is simply, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." That's it. Now you are, according to church doctrine, you were considered to have been spiritually transformed into a Christian.
Yeah, and as you discuss in the book, you go through, again, listeners can read the book where you go through whether it's true or not, and you discuss her, and you discuss the grocer. She alleges the grocer told her, and she says she did it when he was sick, and there's, was he sick? Was he not? Was Edgardo ever out of his parents' sight, and did this ever occur? And there's a lot going on over there. So, but let's talk about the Pope. Pius IX, Pius IX, you mention him and his role, and he plays a very important role in this story. He is in charge of the Inquisition, and he takes a real personal interest in Edgardo throughout Edgardo's life.
Yes, in fact, first of all, I'd say that Pius IX is arguably the most important pope in modern church history. He would, first of all, reign longer than any other pope in church history. But more importantly than that, he was the pope during a transformational time. He became pope in 1846. In 1848, there were revolutions throughout Europe, and one of them was in Rome. And he was driven out of Rome, went into exile, and he would only return 2 years later in 1850, while the Jews, for example, are briefly freed from the ghetto in Rome in 1849. So he has already experienced this. A little later on, he would be the one who would preside over the end of the Papal States. And he would also be the one to call the First Vatican Council and insist that the doctrine of papal infallibility, which had never been official doctrine of the church, be made official doctrine, which it was at his pleading. So this is a very important man. He begins to act as kind of the surrogate father to Edgardo, just because there's become such an international clamor. I mean, to get some idea of this, even in the U.S., in San Francisco, for example, 3,000 people come to a meeting called to free Edgardo, 2,000 in New York to a meeting, and other parts of the U.S. In France, the emperor gets involved in urging that the Pope free Edgardo, return him to his family. So this becomes a big international case, and Pius IX believes his duty as the head of Christendom, spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, to stand on what he regards as basic church doctrine, that this child cannot be allowed to return to Jewish parents because the great sin of apostasy would likely happen, and this he could not tolerate.
So was the outcry, due to, in some part it was, but was it mainly due to Jewish lobbying, so to speak, people behind the scenes trying to get things done? Or was it also because it was just the taking of a child from parents because of a religious claim is so anti the spirit of the time, Enlightenment ideals? It's just like completely opposite of what anyone would think. And is that part of it? Or, do they both play a role?
Well, depends in part, where. In Italy itself, this is a time when there's great agitation for unifying Italy. Many people think of Italy as somehow an ancient, nation state, but it's quite recent. And at this time, in 1858, the Italian peninsula was divided into a series of different states or political entities. And lying across the middle of it was a swath of land ranging from Rome up north through Ferrara to Bologna, which was the Papal States. And so the movement to unify Italy, create a modern Italian nation, had as perhaps its main obstacle, the continuing existence of the Papal States. So the Mortara case became for the people who had become the leaders of the new state, and those who would lead the military expeditions that would result in that state, became a kind of manna from heaven in a way, because it helped them argue that the notion of continuing political power by a pope, and a pope who controls police and an army and so on, that this was in fact not in keeping with modern times. And in France, for example, the Pope in Rome was in power. Remember, I mentioned 10 years earlier he'd been driven out of Rome by a revolt, and what restored Pius IX the power was, in fact, the man who was then the Emperor of France, Napoleon III. And it was his troops who continued to protect the power of the Pope, the political power of the Pope in Rome. So the Pope could ill afford to antagonize the French emperor, but the French emperor himself never really believed in the need for continued political power of the Pope. That is, he too saw this as an anachronism. So, whereas in the U.S., you've got another factor, which is some of those 3,000 people, they weren't just Jews. And part of the way it played out in the U.S. was, if you think of the date, it's not that long after the big Irish Catholic immigration to the U.S. There was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the U.S. among Protestants. Now, the Protestant majority, and they could use the Edgardo Mortara case as further proof of from their point of view, the evils of the Catholic Church and so forth. So this too mixed in.
Yeah, I mean, reading the book, it comes across as the evil Catholic Church, I will say, and the Pope. Now, and we can discuss more soon throughout the story. How and I you kind of highlight this throughout the book, how the Mortara story really is kind of one of the parts and leads to the downfall of the Papal States. Really, the Pope digs in and he won't give in. But the Mortaras, let's go back to the family. You mentioned the father, I think Momolo, if I'm pronouncing his name right, and the mother. And they really try. The father does everything to get Edgardo back. I mean, everything. He's lobbying. He goes to Rome. He goes to visit him. The Rome community gets involved. You can talk about that. But really, nothing kind of works, right?
Yeah. So initially, for one thing, as you mentioned, first father and then together with the mother go to Rome. In previous cases, basically, parents were not allowed to visit the House of the Catechumens where these Jewish children were being held. But because of the international clamor in this case, they allowed the parents to meet a number of times with Edgardo, meeting him, however, only in the presence of the priest who was in charge of the House of the Catechumens and other personnel of the religious personnel of the House of the Catechumens, so in very restricted way. But then the father of Momolo Mortara goes on a kind of a speaking tour, you might say, of Europe, especially France and Britain, getting support from local Jewish organizations as he would make his case, asking for pressure to be put internationally on the Pope to have his child returned to him. All this and Moses Montefiore, who had had some success as representative of the Jewish community in Britain 18 years earlier with the Damascus affair, the ritual murder affair from Damascus, made a trip again to plead with the Pope, but never gets to see the Pope, is kept away, and that too fails. So all these efforts are failures, and the other context here is this protests continue is a year after Edgardo is taken, papal power falls in most of the Papal States, including Bologna. And in fact, in one of the first criminal cases in Bologna under the new regime in January 1859, so this is, January 1860, the inquisitor is arrested and put on trial for kidnapping Edgardo Mortara. And so this is the Pope is now in a much reduced Papal States just around Rome. And it would only be, however, a number of years later that Rome would be liberated by the Italian army. And until then, the Pope would hold on to Edgardo.
So a couple interesting things. First of all, you mentioned Moses Montefiore. I actually think I think we're recording this on his yard site today, which is interesting. And he's, he goes down and he tries to no avail to meet with the Pope to put some pressure. But you mentioned the Inquisitor, Father Feletti, I think, and at his first criminal trial. It's very interesting how you relate the entire story of the trial in the book and what were they really trying to charge him on? Because if he's being tried on something that was legal when he did it, but now it's illegal, it kind of goes down a slippery slope when they're trying to integrate the Papal States into the greater, it kind of create Italy. And it's kind of hard, when you're trying to apply current legal norms with the prior law and you're trying to mix it all together, and it's kind of a mess. And he ends up being let off the hook.
Right. So, in fact, one of the more important sources for my book is the 700 pages of transcript of that trial. So the Father Feletti, is Dominican priest, is put on trial for the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. And the way the trial proceeds is they take testimony from all the relevant people. So not just from him, but from Edgardo's father, his mother, the Anna Morisi, the young woman who theoretically baptized him, the police who seized him and who take him to Rome and so forth. The grocer you mentioned, who, according to the servant who says she baptized him, was her the advisor on how to baptize, and who in his testimony said she never mentioned any of this and he never gave her any advice because he never heard about this before. So it's kind of very dramatic material that you have there. But as you suggested, his defense, the Inquisitor's defense, was all he was doing is observing, obeying the law of the land at the time. And this eventually is a winning argument because after a few months, in I think April that year, he is let out of prison. He is found not guilty on the grounds that he was just obeying the laws that existed at the time. So he is liberated.
Yeah, and even that wasn't really what as you say in the book, it wasn't really what they were looking for. They didn't really need the Inquisitor to be arrested, even though they wanted to bring him to justice, I guess. But they wanted Edgardo back, so that and that they were not able to do. And kind of really the sad thing, I think, is that Edgardo doesn't come back ever. He ends up. You can talk about his rest of his life and his connection with the Pope, and kind of you relay in the book when he meets his father and his mother, they're running away and they're running all over Italy, and then but eventually he's kind of brainwashed. It sounds like reading your book, that's what I came across with. He was a young child, impressionable, and he's just eventually falls under the sway of the Pope and the Church.
Right. He's so he's initially put in this institution in Rome for conversion of Jews. He's then, after a few months, placed in a seminary. And so he grows up in a Catholic seminary, and he's at the same time taken in by the Pope. He gets to see the grandeur of the papacy. Here's this kid who's a 6-year-old who was one of 8 children of a, you might say, middle-class Jewish family in Bologna, living in an apartment there, and now gets to meet with the Pope in the splendor of the papal throne and so on. So at a certain point, it's not entirely clear exactly how long this is after he's initially taken. He decides he's going to, he identifies as Catholic, and in fact will eventually decide he wants to be a priest himself. And when the, one thing I might also mention is the churchmen tell the parents when they come to try to get their child back and the church won't release him, they say, there's a solution to your problem, because if both of you and your children simply see the light and get baptized and become Catholic, there's no problem. The family can be reunited. So you're the ones actually who are preventing reunification of the family. This, however, they rejected out of hand. So it would only be, as I mentioned, Rome, which is where Edgardo is kept in this seminary, is only liberated in famous date, September 20th of 1870. So we're now 12 years after he's been taken. He's now 19 years old. He was 6 when he was taken. He's grown up in Catholic institutions. And his father comes racing into Rome. This is the moment he's been waiting for years. And now, in fact, as I talk about in the book, Edgardo escapes to avoid this encounter with his father and goes on to get ordained as a priest. And in fact, as a talented linguist, apparently is able to give sermons in 7 different languages as he travels around Europe and even comes to the U.S., to Brooklyn and elsewhere in the U.S., using his kind of inspirational story of seeing the light to try to encourage further conversion.
Yeah, and it's kind of a sad ending for the Mortara family, for his father, for his mother, for his siblings. And that's kind of, you read the book, sometimes you read, I said it's gripping, it's a real gripping read, but it's not like a novel. There's no happy ending in that from their point of view. And actually, it's even worse. The ending is actually pretty horrible, if I may say so. When you talk about the Mortara family, what happens to them, and the father, Momolo, what happens to him in Florence, if you want to talk about the court case, I thought that was pretty. The ending was just terrible. Not in your sense of writing the book, just the ending of the story.
Yeah, there's it's not a happy ending of this story in partly in terms of from a Jewish point of view anyway, and becoming a priest and trying to use his story to convince others, including members of his own family who continue to resist this, but to calling on them to convert, trying to get his mother to convert on her deathbed, which she refuses to do. But yes, in a number of years after the Edgardo was taken, the families moved to Florence, and I won't give this away because it's just too dramatic in the book, I think. But he is arrested. That is, Edgardo's father is arrested for the murder of a Christian servant girl, and so the family kind of goes from one tragedy to the next.
You know what I want to say? I want to ask you this and just say this. Not something we discussed before, but you'd think the family would have learned their lesson with the servant girls, with the Catholic servant girls. As you talk about in the book, it's not legal in the Papal States to have a Catholic servant girl, but they did it anyways, and it was commonplace anyways. Jewish families, especially middle class, would have these Catholic servant girls. But like the first one, that probably is what led to the issue with Edgardo, and then they have this issue in Florence. And yes, read it in the book; it's quite dramatic. What happens, but I don't know. I don't know if you have any thought on that. Like, it's interesting.
Right. No, I mean, I of course asked myself the same question because the Mortara case was one of many that Jews at the time were very well aware of. I mean, this didn't have to happen every day for it to be a kind of a trauma on the minds of Jews throughout Italy, wherever the Inquisition had power, because there are many, many cases like this of a child for whom a claim is made that he'd been secretly baptized, and therefore the police are sent on orders of the Inquisitor, and they're taken away from their family. What's unusual about the Edgardo Mortara case is that because times were changing, this becomes a big international cause célèbre. But you would think that this, since many of them do involve, in fact, a Christian servant girl. In fact, one of the kind of defenses of the church in responding to complaints about the taking of Edgardo was that it was to prevent cases of this type that the church had as part of its kind of legal norms that Jewish families are not allowed to employ Christian help in the household help. So I don't know. On the one hand, there's the old kind of Shabbos Goy issue of the advantage for observant Jews to have a Christian in the household for during Sabbath, during Shabbos. But more generally, it just was a mark of having middle class status at the time in Italy. That to be a middle class person without a servant, or let's just call it a maid or domestic help, would be kind of unthinkable. And there just weren't Jewish girls available. Among other things, in Bologna, as I mentioned, there were only a couple of hundred Jews altogether, and very largely a middle-class community. So if you were going to have that kind of household help, it was going to be a Christian and usually an illiterate girl from the countryside.
Right. I guess it's kind of equivalent in America, United States today. A lot of people I know, Jewish families, I mean, I'm sure Jewish families have non-Jewish, cleaning help. It's just, that's the standard people have. It's just, wouldn't be a servant, a little different maybe, but that's like the standard, like you say, as long as middle-class family, that's like standard. It just struck me reading the book, like, especially the second issue. And also what you said there is very interesting and important to point out, which is that this is not the only instance of this happening. This happened a number of times, but the part that made the Mortara story famous is the times and the context in which it takes place.
Yeah, exactly. And, as you alluded to before, I would argue, I think there's good case for this, that the Mortara case, in fact, helped bring about the downfall of the Papal States and the unification of Italy, the birth of the modern Italian nation. For the reasons I mentioned, that it became a very useful argument for the Prime Minister Cavour, who would be, the spearheading the unification of Italy, and Victor Emmanuel II, the Savoyard king, would be the founding king of the Italian state, and became influential also with the protector, the military protector of the Papal States, the Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. So, all this was new. It was also new that the Jews had a kind of free press in many areas. It was new that there was somewhere on the Italian peninsula, namely in Turin, where after the revolutions of 1848, the Jews had more or less freedom, ability to organize politically, to publish what they wanted, and so forth. So this is what was lacking for hundreds of years when Jewish children were taken away from their families on the grounds that they'd been secretly baptized.
Yeah, and I'll say for the listeners, the book is around 300 pages, and the book is a lot more dramatic than we made it here, and quite riveting. And especially in the beginning, the taking of Edgardo, who took him, why the actual story, taking him to Rome, the parents coming to meet him. There's a lot there that we kind of, not glossed over. And the end as well. You go through the trial of Father Feletti, the Inquisitor, quite in depth, and the trial at the end, the trial with Edgardo's father, quite in depth. And, so there's a lot to talk about, and a lot to check it out, and I'll link to the book. One thing I do want to ask you here as we wrap up is that the cover of the copy I have says soon to be a major motion picture, but it has not. That's number of years already that's been going on. So what's the story with soon to be a major motion picture, and will it happen?
Yeah, that's a disappointment, and whether it's going to happen, I still don't really know. Now quite a few years ago, Steven Spielberg got in touch with me, called me up, and told me he read the book twice, and he was eager to make a motion picture based on my book. And then maybe about 5 years ago or so, he in fact took out a full-page ad in the trade press, which had a picture of my book, and had a picture of him and of the man who was going to play the Pope, the fabulous actor Mark Rylance, and the the incredibly talented screenwriter who wrote the screenplay, Tony Kushner. And yet it got delayed, and it's been delayed and still hasn't happened. In the meantime, just a couple of months ago, an Italian director came out with a film called Kidnapped, I guess in English, which is an Italian film made with all Italian actors in Italian language about the Mortara case, and which he says is not based on my book, since he knew that Spielberg had the rights to my book. So, whether this happens, I will say that Tony Kushner's screenplay is absolutely fabulous, and so I'm still hoping this happens. But I've learned that nothing can be counted on with Hollywood, and so we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
So, and you mentioned the new Italian one. Have you seen that? How does that compare to? You did all the research on your book. Is that accurate?
Well, this film is by an Italian director named Marco Bellocchio, who's quite prominent, very senior Italian director. And it's in many ways very Italian, very operatic. And I'd say it captures the main contours of the story. He does introduce a variety of things that didn't happen. But, one, I guess, has a certain amount of license. What I wouldn't want to see is, totally altering the story so that, the family happily reclaims Edgardo and he, becomes a rabbi or something. So, they certainly didn't do that kind of change. But from my point of view, the film that screenplay written by Tony Kushner is much superior in my somewhat biased perspective than what was made into that film. So I'm still hoping that Tony's screenplay sees the light of day.
Okay, I guess we'll see if that happens. Now, one final question for you is, so in the previous episode, we talked about Pope Pius XII and him and the reaction to your book there. Obviously, that was more explosive with the church, and what the reaction in Italy as a whole was and the Catholic Church was. What about this book, the Mortara story? What was the reaction like to this book in Italy and the church?
Well, actually, at the time, this is now, over 2 decades ago, the book came out in Italy, and it got a very positive review in the Vatican Daily newspaper, very much unlike my recent book on Pius XII and World War II and the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust, which got rather viciously attacked by the Vatican newspaper last year. But this book, the book reviewer said, look, it's Pope of the time. John Paul II had said it's important for the church to have a clear-eyed view of its past, to repent for errors of the past. And the other thing he said is that he thought in the book that I don't take a kind of polemical, here are the good guys, there are the bad guys kind of approach, but tried to really understand the mentality and the part of the church at the time, as well as the Jewish community and so forth. So, from my point of view, there's quite a dramatic contrast between the Vatican and church reaction to the Edgardo Mortara, the Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara book, and my recent Pope at War book about World War II, the Holocaust, and the silence of the Pope.
Yeah, and if listeners are interested in that, I can link to that book as well, and you can listen to the previous episode that we did together on the podcast. I don't remember if I asked you this in the last episode, so I'll ask you here, are you working on any new projects now?
Well, I actually am working on a kind of continuation of the World War II and the Vatican and the Jewish community. I became interested in the kind of mass baptism, talking about baptism of Jews, mass baptism of Jews occurring under the various anti-Semitic laws in the 30s, late 30s, and into the war years as thousands of Jews seemed to try to escape persecution through baptism, and the role played by the church and by the Vatican and all this. So that's kind of what I'm immersed in at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me to discuss the Mortara story. And now we'll link to the book in the show's notes for listeners interested. You can purchase the book. And it's, like I said, a great read. Thank you again, Professor Kertzer.
Thank you.